Hello, I'm Andre. Before I start, I want to introduce three other people from the Tulo Center that are here with me. The person who runs the Tulo Center, Sarah Jules, and Jesse James, who's just joined us and is working for the First Nation Tax Commission as well, and one of our sessionals and the person who designs most of our academic curriculum, Norm Lavalley. That was a great introduction, but I can't help but feel a little bit like another BC resident yesterday. Yesterday, BC resident Larry Walker was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he gave an incredible sort of quote about being inducted at the same time as Derek Jeter. He said, you know, there was a time when we used to have 45 records, and on one side of the 45 record was the hit, the A side, and that would be Derek Jeter. And on the other side of the record was the B side, and it was just sort of like a throwaway song, and that's me. So you're going to get presentations from the heads of these institutions that I'm going to talk about today, and it's always good that when we do these presentations that you do these things in the right order of a concert. So it's good that I'm appearing first before the headliners. What I want to talk about today, and I hope it's an interesting thing, is I want to challenge you. And I want this to be provocative, and I want, hopefully, this to lead to questions, and if I'm really lucky, disagreement. Because I believe, and we think, that disagreement is the most fundamental element of good innovations. Is that so often we have these types of presentations, and you know, we take a little bit of information away, and then we say to ourselves, yeah, I don't know about that. If at the end of this, and we ask questions, and some of your questions are, say, I don't know about what you were saying, what that has the potential to do is for us to improve. Because your disagreements or your ideas or questions are how we do things better. So I hope that that's what this leads to, this presentation. And this is really why we're here, and why I have so much, you know, like I want to compliment Chris and Greg and Lucas and whoever else put this on, because I think this is such a great idea to have an opportunity to hear different ideas about how to solve a problem that you are on, not the leading edge, but the bleeding edge of trying to solve. BC has always, you know, had an approach to politics that is considered unique in Canada. And I think it's a real testament to this province that in November, this province was the first in Canada to pass legislation with respect to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But it's creating a challenge. It's creating a huge challenge for you. Because one of the most difficult things that we all have to do is take words and make them real. Words are easy. Words are easy to say. But to really make that piece of legislation move from words to action is what you're being challenged to do. And we really hope that some of the ideas that we're going to present today are going to help you in that challenge. I'm going to start back in Greek philosophy with Aristotle. There are three basic types of arguments. And this is a piece of advice I hope you use. Is that the first type of argument is blame. Who's to blame? Who did what? Those type of arguments almost always end up in court. So when you think of the history of British Columbia and the history of British Columbia with respect to Indigenous peoples, there's been a lot of arguments about blame. The second type of argument are generally political type arguments, but they're really about arguments about values. What do you stand for? What do you believe in? Who am I? What's my identity? And those arguments are almost never solved. So if you want to have a fight with someone that you don't want to solve, make it about your identity. Make it about values. Because we each have our own values. We each have our own identity. And this is why political fights are so nasty. It's because they're about values. It's about what we stand for. And how can they be so stupid? They don't stand for what I stand for. Right? And it drives us crazy. And of course, we have a whole new framework by which to demonstrate our values and signal our virtues, etc., and fight with each other and never solve them. If you want to have an argument that's solvable, make it about the future. Make it about choice. That's the type of argument that can be solved. And what this government has done and what you're being challenged to do is to figure out the best choices for the future. And so a lot of you will be working with various Indigenous governments or Indigenous leaders, and you might be drawn into an argument about values. My advice to you is to turn the argument into an argument about choices. Yes, there's history. We know about blame. Yes, we know what matters to you, but how are we going to fix it? What's the choices we're going to make? And if you're going to make good choices, agree on the criteria of how to evaluate a good choice from a bad choice. So I'm not going to tell you about those criteria that we use till the very end. This is an insanely short history, starting in 1975. In 1975, British Columbia, all First Nations of British Columbia rejected government funds at Chilliwack, British Columbia. It was a seminal event in the history of British Columbia Indigenous history. Subsequently, two strategies emerged. One was known as the Rights and Title Strategy. The other one was known as the Institutional Renewal Strategy. And quite often, these leaders from these two groups would debate openly about the strategy. And in the last 5 years, something amazing has happened. And I just want to talk about the Rights and Title Strategy really quickly. Rights and Title Strategy was basically based on three parts: the courts, the Constitution, and the United Nations. So the Rights and Title Strategy has been to ensure that the rights and titles have been recognized in the courts, to secure the constitutional recognition of these rights and title, and to create the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Unbelievably successful. Rights and title, the courts have been pretty clear in a lot of their determinations, and that's where we're at. So now we have these three things. Now the other path was a series of politicians and leaders, and I'm going to have a little video about them in a second here, who really focused on practical issues. How do we make sure that the garbage gets picked up? How do we develop infrastructure? How do we create land zoning laws and really practical sort of institutional and legal sort of framework development? And so these two paths went for 40 years, and then about 5 years ago they started to realize, hey, wait a minute, we're on the same side. And so you've seen this incredible event happen 2 months ago, where they all joined together and signed a protocol and said, we need each other, because what are rights and title? What are all these victories about if we don't figure out how to implement them? And so I'm going to show a little short video about a little bit of that background.
My traditional name is Kayapalanach. I'm Kayapalanach VII, a direct descendant of the great war chief who met Captain Narvaez in 1791 and then Captain Vancouver in 1792, just off the shores of Point Grey, or at the time it was called Point de Langara. From there I can recollect almost the beginning of time in regards to that public admin and relationship between the government and First Nations, because people don't fully realize it's not that long ago that up until the 60s, government did anything and everything for us. It was total enhanced dependency. And it was until the late 1960s that First Nations started to take on a delegated clerical responsibility of program delivery.
We point out that much of the dissatisfaction with the present act arises from the lack of power and authority to ban councils.
My dad was a chief. He was, I think, elected in about 1961. So I started paying attention, obviously, to what your dad does. You start to pay attention a bit. I started attending general band meetings at a very early age. I must have been about 15 years old, particularly because we were discussing at that time the Trudeau white paper policy. I would attend the meetings, didn't understand all of the issues, but I understood that this was a turning point in our history. So that led ultimately to the formation of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs right here on the Kamloops Reserve. And I attended that. I skipped out of school. I was 17 years old. Attended the meetings at what they now call Maugason Square Gardens, but back then it was just the gym.
And I think Manny, if you really want to know, played hooky for the 6 days that we had the meetings here in Kamloops. And I didn't know it. He didn't, of course, nobody told me. But anyway, I guess maybe that's why he liked taxation.
If you see the famous picture of all of the chiefs, I stood right behind the photographer and listened that whole week with a great amount of interest, wondering what this would mean for our future, because literally that's what we were talking about at that time. And so ultimately the chiefs voted to reject the white paper policy.
3 First Nations that I'm very familiar with, Seashell, Squamish, and Musqueam, got together and said, something's not right here, something's amiss. After a short period, 2 other nations joined this group, and those 2 nations were Kamloops and West Bank. From there, they started to talk about the more serious policy issues that affected First Nations. And again, it's very early in our lifetime in regards to public administration, policy, and legislative concerns. There, the genesis of self-government, the genesis of land management, and the genesis of taxation were discussed and commenced to be developed over that period of time.
You know, that led to ultimately a meeting in Chilliwack called the Rejection of Government Funds. And at that meeting, it was probably one of the most important meetings I ever attended, because it informed what I do to this day. At that meeting, it was an incredible showing of culture, particularly by the Nuu-chah-nulth. It was one of the masks that they brought out, hadn't been brought out in public for over 100 years because of the potlatch laws. And I witnessed that. It was just an incredible ceremony. But the debate itself, which overtook the union meeting, which was calling on all of us to reject government funds. And the debate centered on whether or not we were ready to take such a step.
The Thompson River District fully supports the motion, but instead of June the 1st, we're implementing our decision May the 1st.
But a few that opposed it said we weren't ready. We didn't have an economy. We were dependent on the federal government for education, for housing, and you know, let's wait until we get that happening and then look at rejecting government funds. And all of this was centered around let's get rid of the Indian Act within 5 years. And as I'm fond of saying, this has been the longest 5 years of my life. So the motion was carried, the funds were rejected, and that was in the spring of 1975. And a lot of this, you know, came into focus after I was a council member and started to do my own historical research on, looking at all of the transcripts of the white paper consultation, and realized what we were saying right across the country was very similar. But in particular, those of us in British Columbia and Ontario were of like mind on the tax issue. We were talking the same language. We wanted to occupy the field. The provincial government shouldn't be collecting the tax. We should be able to use this for infrastructure, for education, for all of those good things that real property tax goes to.
Kamloops took on the responsibility of taxation, under the leadership of Manny Jules and Clarence Jules Jr.
I realized that my dad was working on the tax issue from 1965, that he had opposed municipal status because at that point the provincial government was trying to encourage Indian bands at that point to incorporate as a municipality, and we rejected that. From the federal perspective about saying, well, that's a provincial responsibility still, and the provincial government saying, in order for us to give up tax jurisdiction, you have to incorporate as a municipality. And that's when we stepped forward and said, no, there's a Kamloops option. When we adopt our own laws, the federal government should support them, and the provincial government should vacate the tax field. And that's ultimately where this nucleus of creative destruction started to really happen. And that ultimately led to what is now commonly called the Kamloops Amendment.
Sechelt then followed suit by taking on self-government, and they were the first modern-day self-government First Nation. Then shortly thereafter, under the leadership of Robert Louis, land management took off. And as a result of that, you have First Nations Land Management Act. As a result of all of this, you can look across the province of British Columbia in particular, that the result has proven to be a very successful endeavor.
It strengthened us because we were able to have a common cause, and it was all about the rejection of the white paper policy, which is all about assimilation. I wanted us to have our own jurisdiction. I wanted us as First Nations people to be able to live in this land like other Canadians take for granted.
He may be short in stature, but he was very tall in regards to delivering the taxation legislative piece.
All right, so one of the reasons why I wanted to do that was to give you sort of like a preview of the A side when those guys come and speak as well. So it was nice that we had that video. One of the things they referred to was something called the First Nation Fiscal Management Act. I want to give you a little bit of background on what that is, where it came from. It originally started with an amendment to the Indian Act in 1988, which Manny referred to as the Kamloops Amendment, and then it evolved into the Fiscal Management Act. The Fiscal Management Act was based on the idea of the Municipal Finance Authority. It was based upon the Inspector of Municipalities. It was based upon a BC model and a provincial model. And some of the key advisors on the development of that were like former deputy ministers from British Columbia. And that piece of history, I think, is really important for you to consider, because as First Nations think about, and as Indigenous governments propose new ideas to expand jurisdiction, is that there is a history of British Columbia and British Columbia's public service being incredibly supportive of those particular initiatives. So this is some of the background with respect to that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we speak here. So this is really what the essence of it was filling the gaps. And so when Manny talked about we weren't ready, this was the agenda. The agenda was to fill the gaps that, of course, had been destroyed by the Indian Act and replaced by the Department of Indian Affairs. I want to give you, because you're all provincial public servants, I want to give you how we refer to the Department of Indian Affairs, or I guess the Indigenous Services Canada, sorry, and Crown Indigenous Relations, now that there are two of them. Anyway, we refer to them as Canada's worst province. because they have a lot of provincial responsibilities, and the economy that they've evolved is by far the worst in Canada. And so when we think of the institution, when you think of institutional frameworks and think of what this project is and what's been working on, use that as some context. So Manny used this term about creative destruction. I'm going to explain as best I can what that means. And so we have this process that we like to refer to, and with respect to the institutional developments and what they're actually creating and how they're actually changing the legal and administrative framework of Canada, we think. The first slide that I like to talk about is, as you've heard, I'm an economist, and everything I know about economics is on this one slide. So you're going to all have equivalent. I can't grant you the same designation, but I can at least say you're as smart as me after this slide. So across the top, and this is my explanation of how all economies work, by the way. And across the top, we have what economists call comparative advantages, but they're things that a entrepreneur can see an advantage in and make a profit from. So there's all sorts of different advantages out there, and private sector entrepreneurs are ingenious in coming up with ways to make money, right? About how they can take these advantages and utilize them. The difference between rich countries and poor countries in the world is the second part, is you. The difference is the public sector entrepreneur. Because the public sector entrepreneur builds the framework that allows the private sector entrepreneur to be successful. The big difference is that if they're good at what they do, they get rich, they get famous. If you're good at what you do, crickets. You made a difference. That's what you get. But you create the framework that allows economies to thrive. And what are those things that you build? You build the legal framework, the laws that allow certainty so that people can make investments and believe in the future. You have a good administration, excellent governance, excellent leadership. You have a mechanism by which, in the event that we don't like the direction we're going, we can change it through politics. And people, if they want to do work in British Columbia, they get to work with you and you get things done, right? That's so important to an economy. Infrastructure, holy cow. If you don't have the ability to move goods to markets, if you don't have the ability to move information as quickly as possible, as fast as someone else, you lose. The infrastructure is so important. And the last thing is really the essence of government. You've got to create a system where people receive good quality public services at a fair price called taxes. We call that a fiscal relationship. And if you can do all that, the private sector can succeed. So many places in the world don't have the second part. So if you want to say, why is that place poor? Look there. And if you want to say, why are First Nations impoverished? Look there. And do you know how we know this? We know this from a statistic. And it's a 20-year-old statistic, but I'll use it anyway. The statistic is this. If you want to go into the city of Kamloops and build a residential development, it'll take you 6 months, 6 to 12 months, based upon the development approvals, etc. You want to go across the road, across a bridge, literally, to the Kamloops First Nation and build that same residential development, it'll take you 48 to 60 months. 4 to 6 times longer. You want to explain in one statistic why, when you go through a reserve, why is there so much economic underdevelopment? There it is. It's 4 to 6 times more expensive, 4 to 6 times longer. So if you want to fix that, you got to fix this. And so that's what Manny and Howard and Clarence Jewell Sr. were talking about, is building that. And so that's why that 1975 moment was so important. And it's so important because it happened in British Columbia. If you think of the rights and title agenda, the institutional development agenda, they both started here. So the history of decolonization is such a BC initiative. And if you can get these things right, you can get a comparative advantage. When you think about what your job is, that's it. Your job is to make this province work for everyone. This is the problem with First Nation economic development. And it's a problem too with a process what we call self-government too. What if we just say, okay, First Nations, here's all the jurisdictions: child welfare, lands, taxation, fisheries, forestry. Yep, here you go. You have all these jurisdictions. That's what you're saying. Here's all the car parts. Build. What is this, by the way? Somebody here tell me what type of car this is. Thank you. Right, build a Volkswagen Golf. It's really hard, and I can't speak for all of you, but I guarantee I wouldn't get this right if you did this to me. And you can't do that. And that's what an institutional framework is. An institutional framework is the blueprint. How do you build this? How do you put this together? And this is why we think that the approach that I'm going to be talking about here in a second is the better approach to helping build this economy for First Nations. Now it's very popular to talk about algorithms. What's your algorithm? How did you come to that idea? This is our algorithm. So when we say we're helping to build institutions or building legal frameworks, or this is the process we follow. And on the left-hand side here is where everyone always gets stuck. Is that we see a cause and we think that's a solution. We see a piece of law, we see a court case, and we say, we won. Or, the law's been changed. That's the start. That's not the finish. And so all of these things can create an impetus for a change. But then how do we make a change? Well, first it's got to start with an idea. I love this phrase, collision of hunches. Because where do our ideas come from? They come from us thinking about things and pulling little pieces from here and there, and we have this collision, and all of a sudden, wow, that might work. And we turn it into a proposal, and we turn it into a plan, and then we do the hard stuff. The most important thing, and people are talking to you all sorts of ideas about how to implement UNDRIP. I know you're going to have lots, and lots of you already have lots of ideas, I'm sure. Right? This is where the rubber hits the road, is your evaluation. Is it going to work? And these are the four things, that we found are the most important things about whether something works or not. Number one is, does it reduce transaction costs? Does it make it easier for you to get something done? So, for example, when I talked about 4 to 6 times higher, does it reduce those costs of getting something done for those First Nations that want to develop their lands? Right? Transaction costs are the number one thing that leads to greater economic development. Number two, and this is the most common error people make, is they don't think about the switching costs. How do I go from the old system to the new system as cheaply as possible? This idea was by the chief economist of Google. He came up with this idea. His name is Hal Varian, and he said, what makes Google work is that our switching costs are way lower than everyone else's, and that's all they focus on, making you move from the old system to the new system. And many of you don't even remember AOL or Yahoo or any of those previous, but they made it so easy to move from the old ways of doing things to the new ways. The next one is disagreement. We don't disagree enough. And I don't mean like mean disagree. I don't mean disagreeable. I mean disagree based upon whether you think it's going to do these things. Objective criteria. Does that reduce the cost of doing things? Does that make it easier to move from this system to the other? Disagree. I think we can do it better. That is so important to design and build better ideas. If you can get through those two things, then you can make real change. You can make legislation, you can make institutions. And if you do institutions, you can make standards, and because standards are what allows business and trade to occur. Because it makes it easier and cheaper, and when you can do that, you can do education and training, which is what the Tulo Center is all about. And we wouldn't be here without all of that stuff happening. So when people say, sure, you want to change, but how? That's our algorithm. Because, and you know the thing that makes this, I think it keeps us young anyway, is that this never ends. Because events happen. Things happen and you got to start again. Technology changes or an environmental issue occurs and you've got to reinvent things. And that's the challenge that you've got to do. And I was talking to Greg about this at lunchtime. It was a really good discussion because I said, well, because I was thinking about this. What's the provincial approach to renewing your institutions, to making it work in an UNDRIP environment? What's the innovation process you're going to use? This is the innovation process that we're going to think about with respect to working with it and building new Indigenous institutions, but what's going to be yours? So those are the three things that we think increase the probability of success. If you can reduce transaction costs, if you can reduce switching costs, and if you can increase positive network effects. That means that the more people join, the more benefits you get. People always use words. Sustainable. I love that word. What does sustainable mean? What is sustainable economic development? I'm going to give you my definition, and I hope it's a useful one. Sustainable economic development is an efficient method to reinvent your public institutions. It's the process that you have that leads to sustainable economic development. It's whatever your innovation process is going to be, that's the one that's going to lead to sustainable economic development for British Columbia. And as long as it continually improves, you're going to continually support advantages. None of us can see the future, but we can all know that as the future comes, we've got to change. And we've got to have a very efficient process to make those changes. And one of the changes that you're being asked to do is implement the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And if we get this right, we will destroy the Indian Act and the Indigenous Services Canada. Because what will happen is these innovations will work, they'll lead to positive economic results, more First Nations will join. That means less First Nations will use the Indian Act. If we keep doing it again, it'll happen again and again and again. So if you're saying there's no hope, there is hope. Right? There is an idea, we think anyway, that can actually make these changes. And here's our proof. In 2008, when the legislation was first started to be implemented, we had about 60 First Nations. By 2010, there was a little bit of a dip. And in the last 6 or 7 years, there's been this exponential growth. Any technological innovation tries to achieve something called the S-curve. The S-curve is this little path, right? So you start out, there's a few early adapters, and then all of a sudden everyone uses it. Think of Snapchat, for example, or Spotify, things like that. So a few early adapters, then bang, and then it levels out. Well, that's what's happening with the First Nation Fiscal Management Act, also with the First Nation Land Management Act, is you're seeing almost 300 First Nations now involved in this. And that's a phenomenal growth compared to any other sort of initiative, whether it's treaty settlement or self-government or other sort of, and why? All right, now here's some of the results of that. All the good positive economic growth, how many First Nations, how much has increased the revenues. Of course, we're very happy about the amount of students we have and the amount of courses that we've developed. But this is why we think it worked. It lowered transaction costs. It's easier to do business on First Nation land as a result of this. Lots of good sample laws, lots of good templates, lots of good mechanisms to make it easier to switch from the old system to the new system. Of course, the Tulo Center is quite helpful in that, we hope. And a real sort of incentive to keep innovating. Because as long as the Indian Act exists, as long as You know, there's a federal department that's in charge of Indigenous affairs. There's going to be an incentive to innovate, and so you're going to see more and more innovations that occur as a result of this. So now I'm going to get to what I hope you're interested in. We have some ideas, because we hope you believe in the in what we've talked about so far with respect to what our model is and how we hope to make these changes. But we think there's a whole bunch of new ideas that have to be implemented to continue this process. In 2018, First Nations that were part of the First Nation Fiscal Management Act and the First Nation Land Management Act started to meet. And they chose to meet the very first time where it all began. Well, not in British Columbia, not precisely where it all began, but anyway, near where it all began. And they looked at a series of initiatives, and they talked about the success stories, and you guys are going to hear some of these success stories as well later in these presentations. And then they met again last year, and they said, you know what, we got to formalize this. And so now they formed a protocol, and they're really interested in advancing all of these ideas. And so you're seeing these institutions working together, so they're not siloed. And this is a real challenge for you, because each one of your branches, each one of your departments, each one of your ministries, excuse me, has its own mandate, has its own mandate letter, has its own challenges. You're being asked to implement something that crosses all of that. Because if you don't communicate with each other, and that's why I think this is such a great forum for this, because it's such a good forum for you to have these discussions in and to ask the questions. But if you don't communicate between each other and don't support each other, we're going to get higher costs of doing business, higher switching costs, lower network effects. If you really want to help, you've got to figure out how to coordinate with each other and, of course, with First Nation institutions. So we're going to talk about each one of these different proposals. I'm going to give you a very, very quick overview because I want to have time for questions. To me, that's where we're going to have a good conversation, is if you have some questions. But I do want to mention this. The first thing that I want to mention is using the Fiscal Management Act post-treaty. For reasons of politics and history, treaties were developed in a way where they excluded the Fiscal Management Act, they excluded the First Nation Land Management Act, and as a result, these First Nations who use these things now don't have any institutional support once they do a treaty. You're giving them back to the car. You're taking away the part that helps them build their car and saying, okay, now it's over to you. That's not an effective way to help see economic growth, and it's not an effective way to solve treaties and self-government. You've got to think of how you're going to have to integrate the Fiscal Management Act, the First Nation Land Management Act into the treaty environment. I know that's a big policy issue, but you've got to figure it out, because you're hurting the First Nations that are in the treaty process, and you're probably hurting the provincial economic development. Your goal should be thinking about how do we make the provincial economy grow and benefit everyone. And by preventing that particular option for First Nations, you may be slowing economic growth. It's always so weird when you do self-promotion. I got to get better at this. But anyway, the Tulo Centre for Indigenous Economics, we're very proud of what we've accomplished. You know that diagram I showed with respect to the public institutions, and that's really what we do. We have courses and programs that we like to offer in each one of those areas. And it's original curriculum. It's based on the Fiscal Management Act. It's based on the First Nation Land Management Act. It's based on different approaches that different self-government First Nations use. We think we're the best source for applied First Nation economics that you can take in Canada. And the evidence that we're getting from this is this little bit of I don't know if I want to say it, trivia is not the right word. This little inquiry we just recently received. The province of Manitoba would like us to move Tulo there. They say, well, why don't we have this in Manitoba? Because we're getting so many students from Manitoba. We're having students from across the country coming to our program. Manitoba seems to be where we're getting the most students from. And so I sort of like put that out there saying, you know, you might want us to stay in British Columbia, but it's up to you. We've got another offer. So we have a textbook, we have, you know, papers you can read that explain all the stuff I'm talking about here. So if you're interested in following up on us, please, you know, go to tulo.ca and see all the stuff we're working on. We have a big idea, you know. As more and more communities want to come and take our programs, we think we would like to have our own campus. We're running out of room at Thompson River University. They just don't have, we have all of our last 2 classes have been oversubscribed, sort of like this, it's kind of cool. But anyway, and it's because of the programming we're offering. And so we would like to see a campus, and we'd like to, you know, to see this made in BC success story stay in BC. We're really working on something called a First Nation Infrastructure Institute. And we really believe that has real opportunity to really help First Nations. And it's ironically, again, based upon a lot of the things we've learned from the BC provincial and municipal framework about the whole sort of life cycle approach to planning and development and to fiscal, matching the right fiscal resources to the stage of the infrastructure cycle. And so we're developing a First Nation Infrastructure Institute. We hope it becomes legislation in the next year or so, and it'll be part of this family. So that not only will you have the fiscal tools, not only will you have the financial tools, but you'll also have the ability to use those tools to build the infrastructure. So which we think will have will hopefully even, you know, speed up economic development even further. And one of the big areas in that regard, and I want to just take one little step back here. How many people here have been to something called diversity training? Okay. In 2016, the Harvard, and I want to say political and sociology department, there's 3 people from those programs, did a study. And if I get the numbers wrong, it's because I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was 1,100 diversity training studies that they looked at. And they measured something called implicit bias, because the purpose of doing these diversity studies is to reduce our implicit bias. And they measured the implicit bias before, after, and then 6 months later. And they found the following. Diversity training either, at best, does nothing to implicit bias, or probably makes it worse. They said only 2 things in their studies showed a significant and lasting decrease in implicit bias. And that was the integration of troops in the Second World War and the integration of troops in the Vietnam War. So what they found, based on that, is that the only way that implicit bias declines is if different groups of people work together on a practical project. The reason I brought this up when I saw the infrastructure slide is I'm thinking of local governments and First Nations. Quite often they have to work together on a practical infrastructure project. And that is such an opportunity to reduce implicit bias. And so when we talk about ideas here, if we can figure out a way to work together, that's going to be the way that implicit bias and the province changes. We can talk. Words are nice. Legislation is nice. It shows commitment. It shows intention. Action, actual projects, practical things are going to change things. And so I really, when I think of the infrastructure, I think it is as one of the most practical things we've thought about designing and building. And I really hope that, that when it moves through the legislative process that, as you have been in the past, the British Columbia government was extremely supportive of implementing what was called at the time the Self-Government Enabling Act in 1991. And I hope that same support occurs for the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. This is more of a complaint about the federal government, not the provincial government, but this is my words in action writ large. the most important people in Canada are Indigenous people, said the Prime Minister. We believe in reconciliation. And then when push came to shove, a deal was cut between the province and the federal government, and First Nations were left out. And now there's all sorts of trade occurring in the cannabis industry that may have something to do with First Nations, that's reducing the revenues of Canada and the provinces. This needs to be fixed. First Nations are advancing a series of ideas with respect to cannabis jurisdiction and the cannabis fiscal framework, and I think that this will eventually come to you, and we're going to have to figure out how to fix this problem, and this will be one of those issues that hopefully we can figure out, not unlike we figured out local taxes and property taxes and things like that. One of the areas where the provincial government and First Nations should be aligned is the following. Both the province and First Nations should want First Nations to get more federal tax room. You've got to think about your own revenues. Provinces have many more expenditure responsibilities than the federal government. The best area for First Nations to expand their fiscal powers is in the federal area. And as a province, you should be able to think for about a second and say, well, that's a good idea. And First Nations are really proposing to expand in that area. One of those areas is with the First Nation goods and services tax. Another one is a very specific type of goods and services tax with respect to fuel, alcohol, and cannabis and tobacco, what we call the FACT, F-A-C-T tax. And so we really think that there's a strong case to be made for why the province should support First Nations in this regard. And we have some good rationale for why you might want to think about that. We have a really big idea that we want to talk about too, and I know that this is going to be talked about by other leaders when they come and speak to you. Certainly by the Chief Commissioner Jules will certainly speak about this. Is the First Nation resource charge. One of the biggest problems and barriers with respect to development. British Columbia is going through this writ large, is what do you do when a project proponent has to, wants to advance their project and has to negotiate with First Nations, has to do all this consultation with First Nations. What does that do to the investment climate with respect to resource development in British Columbia? Probably not the best. It certainly is raising transaction costs. So how do you deal with that? Well, how do you deal with that? Well, you have processes put in place, you have environmental frameworks put in place, you have a charge, you have a tax. They pay a series of taxes to the provincial government to ensure that you can create the regulatory framework. I think First Nations are asking for the same thing. We have a series of First Nations that are very interested, especially in British Columbia, in implementing a First Nation resource charge when there's development in their territory. And the hope is that that creates a lot more clarity, a lot more transparency, and a lot more simplicity for potential projects in British Columbia. Sorry. Is that my last one? Oh yeah, that is. Okay. So this is my last slide. So what can we do together? One of the things that we've seen as the most important thing that we can have is a champion. We want leaders. We want people like yourself to believe that this could work and that you can help us advance some of our ideas. So if you're interested in this stuff, please ask questions. Please read more, and talk to us. We're tulo.ca. You can get a hold of any of us with just putting our first name with tulo.ca at the end. And we want you to help us. And so we want you to be part of this process. Obviously, we want you to look at some of these proposals and seriously consider them and think about how we can improve them. And see if and think about how they support what you're being challenged to do. Because you're being challenged to implement UNDRIP. We've given you a whole bunch of ideas, a whole bunch of practical, we hope, ideas that'll lead to greater economic development for First Nations and British Columbia. Your job, we hope. So we hope that you look at these and you evaluate them critically. And evaluate them based on those 3 areas that we think are objective. Do they make it easier to do things? Can we implement it easily? Is it going to benefit the more of us that use it? Are we going to get even more benefits? So, when we approach you for legislative development support, we hope that you're able to support and provide the briefing to the various people that you have to provide in order for them to support it. So I want to say thank you for this time on behalf of the Tulo Center, but I also, my one sort of hope from all of this is that when you get a chance to ask questions, you're disagreeable. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Andre, for a engaging and thought-provoking presentation. We're going to take a little time for questions at this point, so warm up your thoughts and bring them forward for all of us to learn and share.
Andre, thank you. Andre, thank you very much for this presentation. I've been reading in the newspaper recently about something called the 10-year grant and how this is going to really change First Nations' abilities to really have longer-term planning and vastly reduce the transaction costs for working with the Department of Indigenous Services. Can you tell me how this came about? Like what does this mean, and why would it be of interest for us to know about it? Just a small question.
Yeah, so it came about because of a relationship between the Assembly of First Nations and Canada, thinking about what can be a first step. What's a first step to a better relationship? And I want to ask a question before I answer that question. Is anyone here work in federal provincial relations? Excellent. You shouldn't have put up your hand. How many people are involved in making sure that the payments that come from Canada with respect to equalization, although I know BC doesn't receive any, but the Canadian Health and Social Transfer, how many people are involved in making sure that number's right? But what, 3? Very, very, very tiny group. How big is the CHSC transfer from Canada to BC? Well, it's billions, isn't it? Over $1 billion? Anyway, the reason I asked that question is that, do you have any idea how many people are involved in transferring $8 billion to First Nations? Thousands. So when you think about going from a 1-year grant involving thousands of people to a 10-year grant, a lot of people are going to be twiddling their thumbs for 9 years till the next one comes around. So it creates a whole different environment. Now the problem with the grant, of course, is how much and it's the same thing that the provinces have, right? Now we're talking about the same issues that provinces have that for First Nations. How do you determine how much is provided from the federal government to pay for something? Right? What's the right number? What's the national standard? That's the whole point, theoretically, of equalization, right? We're trying to achieve a national standard. So what are the right numbers that can be achieved in that? And so it's a positive development in that it reduces the role between First Nations and Indigenous Services Canada. It's probably not anywhere close to what needs to be, because we have no idea whether it's going to achieve the national standards. And how do you achieve those national standards? Our philosophy, I hope you sort of gathered it from this, is that we believe that the more First Nation fiscal powers that are available, the more likely they are to be involved in economic development because it can generate more fiscal revenues for them. There's not a necessarily relationship between economic development and those grants that creates that incentive. So we think it's a step, but we don't think that's an actual new fiscal relationship.
So thanks, Andre, for, can you hear me? So you talked about the Infrastructure Institute, and I know years ago I was working with the SNTC years ago, and I remember Manny had started a pool of First Nations to basically support, I think it was bond system to help with building infrastructure because it's so key to development and business opportunities. Also now, BC has stepped into, through the Indigenous Housing Fund, as they're actually stepping into building on reserves, and big barrier is infrastructure. So I'm just curious if there's lots of discussion around that and how, if there's things happening in that area still.
That's a great question. You worked for the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council? When did you work for them? Sorry, this is like super inside stuff here. I was hired by the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council to create the Statistical Institute. I was hired by Bob Manuel. I worked for Art Manuel, and so before I worked for Manny Jules, I have this a great affection until from 1991 to 1995. Anyway, blah blah blah. Anyway. So the Infrastructure Institute is precisely for that reason. It's the silo problem. So what happens is you've got infrastructure funding for First Nations and for local governments coming from all of these different sources. And so how do you coordinate all of those funding sources for building infrastructure, but then operating and maintaining it so that it actually reaches life cycle? And so the purpose of the Infrastructure Institute is to start to breaking down those silos, have an institution that can work with, bring in provincial monies that can finance, the infrastructure for housing or the actual housing, just as an example, right? Can make sure that there's the fees in place or that ensure that the infrastructure is paid for operation and maintenance, so that we actually build infrastructure that lasts. One of the fears that the province probably has with respect to building housing on reserve is disposable housing. Right? What's the average lifespan of a house on reserve? Well, depending on what part of the country it is, it can be as low as 7 years. Think about that. A house that lasts 7 years. Right? And you don't want that, right? So you want to make sure the infrastructure is in place that, because that's obviously what could lead to a lot of housing deterioration. So I think there's a real opportunity to partner and to support that, to achieve better results for that.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the First Nations natural resource tax that you mentioned. What might that look like?
Yeah, so this is one of those really big but complicated ideas that's going to require a lot of discussion and a lot of work with the province. So right now you have revenue sharing arrangements with First Nations, in some cases with respect to mining. I'm going to use that as an example just to make it easier, okay? Suppose you converted that revenue sharing arrangement to an actual tax. So it's the same amount of money, but it's a tax. Now, suppose you said to the federal government, we want to come with the First Nations and we want to ask for, let's just make it easy, a corporate tax credit. So that when mining company X pays the First Nation this charge, tax, whatever we call it, right, you're going to reduce their corporate taxes by that amount. Think of the investment climate of impact in British Columbia of that. We have a clear, transparent tax. We have a federal offset, so that's not an extra tax on the mining company. The provinces remain whole. So, and think about it also from a responsibility, from the province's perspective. who should bear the costs of implementing UNDRIP and title? And it's probably partly province, but probably more the federal government. And so this is a way of like balancing that better and dealing with some of the provincial issues. I know that you're going to be under cost constraints. We all know what healthcare and aging populations have, right? What's going to happen in the future. We've got to think about how we rebalance the federation and maybe solve 2 or 3 problems at once. You know, we've got a resource climate that's having trouble figuring out how to deal with Aboriginal title. We've got provinces that need more fiscal resources, and we've got a federal government that can help to fix that, can fix both those problems. And so that's really what we're proposing, is that First Nations charge a transparent tax with respect to resource development, and there be a federal tax credit that offsets that. And I know this person at the back has asked 3 times, and I see them, I always feel bad because they're so far back they don't get to ask their question.
Institutional culture so that people actually put the work in to make that process happen, and where you see it, how do you approach it?
Oh, that is a great question. There's 2. I got to ask you a clarification. When you speak of institutional culture, do you mean your institutional culture, or do you mean sort of the coordinated institutional culture? What you just articulated is what we want to be able to do at the Tulo Center. We want to look at how do you create those institutional frameworks that coordinate well with other governments. Like, think of one of the biggest problems, like just pick one simple but difficult problem. A First Nation is right beside a local government, and they have different land laws, and you've got to develop, but the First Nation is buying fire services from the local government, so you've got to have fire hydrants the same size, or something like that, right? Now you've got a coordination issue. How do you solve that institutional problem? Well, we really think that, of course, part of it is service agreements, part of it's just, common sense in that case. But we really think there's a real opportunity there to teach both for First Nations that are interested and other governments the benefits of working together and solving those problems, and coming up with institutional designs that do that. What's the obvious institutional design? Well, the obvious institutional design is joint planning, right? You should think about creating a framework by which you plan development in a way that leads to infrastructure that can, and businesses that can have fire protection, right? That's the obvious, but where does that come from? We think it comes from learning the skills to create those partnerships, and we like to believe that some of our material, some of our curriculum does that. So we think that's, but the other part of your question is, where do those ideas come from? Because how do you solve those problems? And the ideas come from us. They come here. That's the only place they'll ever come from, between our ears. And it's going to come from you, it's going to come from First Nations, it's going to come from good constructive discussions, but it's going to come from you saying, okay, that might work, but this might work better, right? It's that working together, it's the solving the problems together, and creating forums like this, but taking this a step further, right? Like saying, instead of us just talking about a bunch of ideas, let's attack a problem. And let's not be afraid. One of the things it's so help if any of you are in treaty negotiations, this quite often happens. Let's put that in the too hard pile. That's just too big an issue. That's too hard. Oh, we've got an issue with respect to a gas pipeline up north. That's too hard. Don't be afraid. Bring that problem. Create an environment where people can talk and disagree and agree on what we're trying to achieve, and somewhere, I believe it, in between this crowd and lots of other crowds, we're going to figure out these problems, but we can't be afraid of the problems. And like I say, I think it's a great question, and that's why, the Tulo Center was started, was to, in an academic, university-type environment, start to solve some of these problems. But we also think there's lots of other venues to solve those problems too.
Like everybody else, just want to say thank you and appreciate the opportunity for the dialogue. And kind of in the spirit of your response to the last question, I'm intrigued with regards to the Fiscal Management Act, or the other kind of ideas that you've been speaking to. What is the respective relationships in terms of signing on, showing support, and building that kind of network of participants, and the somewhat, I guess it's something I don't totally understand, but the hereditary kind of authority of hereditary chiefs, and then the sort of lasting colonial infrastructure of the band and elected council. I'm just curious how that gets navigated with respect to participation in these activities that you're describing.
If I could solve that problem, I probably wouldn't be here. But I am going to give you a stock answer that I know that if Manny Jules was here, this is the answer he'd give. Solving problems is a two-part equation. The one part is what you get from this little presentation. And we like to call that the science, right? It's the science of institution building. It's the science of creating a better governance framework. The other part is the art of politics. And you have to have both. You have to have, precisely as you say, you have to create a coalition. You have to create the political ability to solve the problem, so that you actually have someone who can make a decision. But you also have to have good science that says this is, we think, the best approach, and here we've disagreed and come up with these good ideas for solving that problem. You have to do both. And so that particular problem may not be a scientific one. It may be a political one. And part of the problem in any disagreement, and this is a skill that anyone who's been in a long-term relationship knows how to deal with. Part of the problem in solving a really difficult political situation is to give the other party a way out. And to say, okay, can we hear the interest and provide you with a mechanism that gets us towards the better solution, but still allows you not to have to completely give up something. If you're a fan of behavioral science, one of the greatest sort of lessons in behavioral science is something called loss aversion. And what loss aversion is when we feel we're losing something, we will fight way harder for it than if we just feel we have an opportunity to gain something. So this is why politics quite often uses fear. Oh, hidden agenda. Oh, they're up to something, right? Because we're afraid of losing something. So they create this emotional response in us, right? So why? So when you think of that particular situation, if you're thinking, well, how are we going to deal with this? You have to be very cognizant of loss aversion, because that group of people, that's their identity. That's who they are. You want to take that? Good luck. They'll fight literally to the death for their identity. That's who we are. So you have to think in that regard. And remember what I was talking about earlier. That argument can't be about the values. Do you care about the environment? If you're going to make that the argument, it'll never end. The question has to be, how do we do something? What's the choice we make to get to something that leads us to, right? And so I agree with you. It's a tough one, But I think a lot of it is framing it. And I don't know if that helped or not.
Hi. First, I want to give a shout out to Tulo's textbook, which I found very informative on Indigenous economic development and just the basics of, property tax and having a tax base and property rights and all those sort of institutional frameworks. It seemed very common sense to me. I fully understood it. So I apologize for my next question, which is that I understand there are, you've got 300 Indigenous communities that are on the FMA now. But there's other communities as well who have different models for economic development and are also being successful. So what are some of the main critiques that you've heard of the institutional frameworks that Tulo's very enthusiastic about and the trade-offs between the different models that are out there?
I'm going to give you a short answer, and I don't want to take up too much of your time because it's a really good question. It's an incredibly good question. But here's the short answer. If there was an answer to that question, there wouldn't be issues. It is so important that we think and innovate and come up with new models. I always, we have two sons, and I always say there's the three most important things you have to learn in life are these sentences. I was wrong. I am sorry. I'll try to do better. And the reason you have to be able to admit I was wrong is because we are. The only two things that you can do in economic development is be curious and humble. So those models, I hope they all work, and I hope they're way better than the ones we're proposing, and I hope that we learn from them, because we want to, and we want to adapt them. Does this mean this is the best approach? No, but it's working for some First Nations, and more First Nations are joining. Right? Certain problems can be solved at a local level. Certain problems can be solved at a regional level. Some problems, provincial level, some problems, national. Just like Canada has all of those frameworks, First Nations probably need similar frameworks. So the institutional framework may not work on a lot of problems, and some First Nations can resolve them without them. Right? That's good. Great. What do we? The result we want isn't that they do it this way. The result we want is that they're successful. That's what we get the benefits from. So we constantly innovate, constantly update, constantly bring in the models that we think are the best ones for First Nations to use in particular situations. That's our role at Tulo, is not to tell you how to do something, but to give you the tools to solve the problem, and hopefully you'll innovate and solve them. I don't know if that didn't really answer the question about critiques, but that is the critique, is that it's not everything, and it doesn't solve all problems, and there's other ideas.
So I work in the Ministry of Finance, Tax Policy, and Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations branch. When we do our budget process, the way we kind of do the tax, it links directly to the service side, the expenditure side. And so generally how it works is there's an expenditure need, and maybe there's a gap, and there's not enough revenue, and so we have the conversation about how to fill that need, or vice versa. Maybe there's too much revenue being brought in, and we don't need as much, and so then there's a conversation about, well, where can you give it back? What's the best way to do that? So that's always kind of how the conversation works. So when somebody asks, what about this revenue? What about that revenue? The first question we ask is, what do you want to spend the money on? Because we're just looking at we're making sure we have enough money to provide all the services that British Columbians are looking for. And so I guess my question is, there's a desire for revenues from the federal government. I'm just curious, what are the funding pressures that's going to satisfy? What are the expenditure pressures, like the key ones that those are going to satisfy?
This is a really good question, because in 2 weeks we have our program. We have cohorts that come through, right? And we have 3 different programs. One's in applied economics, one's in tax administration, one's in land management. And the tax program in 2 or 3 weeks, I don't know what exactly it is, we'll be teaching the course on budgeting. And the key aspect is precisely the way you laid it out. Here's our revenues. Here's our expenditure priorities. How are we going to allocate to achieve the goals? Now, when we talk about this in class, and of course it's easy to talk about in class, but we think about it, I think, in a very similar way that you're thinking about it. Is that, okay, what are the, we make, the communities have their priorities, and here's our expenditure priorities, but how do we use those revenues in the best possible way to grow revenues to fill the gaps that we've identified? And because you're not going to do it every year, right? And there's not going to be enough. This year, there's not going to be enough for education, or this year, there's not going to be enough for housing, or whatever the particular priority is. And so you've got to make those priorities, and you've got to some revenues, and you've got to make some expenditures, and you've got to do your best to do 2 things, I think. 1, grow the economy so that you can grow revenues. And 2, ensure that these measures that you do make will be politically popular enough so that for the political decisions that are being made with respect to those expenditures. And so First Nations are making similar decisions. What we're trying to establish is a better ability for First Nations to grow their revenues. Instead of spending so much time lobbying the federal government for transfers, what if they had the ability to grow their tax bases? They had a big enough tax basis to meet their expenditure requirements. And so that's really what we're suggesting, is that instead of focusing so much effort on something that's basically a large lobbying effort, why don't we put more effort into growing our economies? Because that's how our revenues will grow, and that's how we'll be able to meet those expenditure responsibilities. And I think the bigger question you're asking is, what is that list of expenditures? Which I think is what makes the Fiscal Management Act a really interesting thing for you to think about. Because what the Fiscal Management Act does is create an expenditure law. Every year, First Nations who are part of the Fiscal Management Act have to pass an expenditure law. In that expenditure law, here's our revenues, here's our expenditures. Those expenditure categories happen to match up with the precise categories, at least they used to, not exactly anymore, but they used to match up with the precise categories that were used by something that the provincial government used to call, I think they used to call the blue books, which were the local government expenditures, right? And they used to match up almost exactly with those categories. Now they match up with what's it called? The statistical accounting standards for regional governments. But anyway, but the point is that there's a series of expenditures, there's a series of revenues. The framework and the budgeting method is the same, and there's an expenditure law, and that expenditure law, in theory, is audited every year by the Financial Management Board to make sure that expenditures match up and revenues match up, and of course there's a report so that it's transparent, it's accountable, and hopefully it's familiar. And so when we say we want to have the FMA framework brought into the treaty system, because we think a lot of First Nations would like it brought in, it shouldn't be something that the provincial government goes, ooh, I don't know. It's what you use. It's the same idea in terms of budgeting, and we just want to put more revenues in there, more tax revenues, and grow these. So it's almost, I like to think of it like an incremental jurisdiction. The more that the First Nation revenue base grows, the more jurisdiction they occupy. That's the creative destruction thing.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question where the answer is probably easy, and it's probably a stupid question, but I don't come from a finance background. So as we work on creative destruction to colonialism and support our First Nations in developing their economies, are they held to the, and I'm guessing the answer is yes, to the various free trade agreements that the federal government has negotiated for Canada? Do they have to abide by the terms of free trade agreements? I'm just asking that because I'm not sure. I'm curious whether they would have, whether they were part of the discussions of the terms that go into those agreements.
That's a good question. I don't know the exact answer because I've never been, I'm not familiar with the, but I would be surprised if the answer wasn't yes. But I don't know the exact answer. I do know that when we, spend time in classrooms talking about this with the very, there's generally, at least among our students, a great desire to be part of these free trade arrangements and to expand them, right? And so that First Nations have access to markets, but that may not apply to all First Nations. So, right, I can't answer the question. I can only answer the question on behalf of the people, that we work with.
Hello, thank you so much. Thanks so much for your talk.
Okay.
That's okay. You had, at the beginning of your talk, made the distinction between words and action, so I hate to ask a words-based question, but has Tulo analyzed the province's recently passed UNDRIP legislation and used an opportunities lens, if you will, in analyzing that legislation? And would those thoughts perhaps help us here in the civil service, where we've been recently tasked to look at that legislation seriously and see how its impacts will flow to each of our respective areas?
Be more, just go expand the question a bit more, make it a little more practical so I don't use another generic answer.
No worries. So I'm asking a words-based question. No. But has your area, your colleagues, your students, taken a close look at the province's recently passed UNDRIP legislation? And have you posted your own recommendations or insights based on the province's recently passed legislation?
Well, I mean, the short answer is that's what we were trying to do today. We were trying to say, here's some ideas. Here's some ideas you might want to think about that you can work with. We've got a lot of First Nations, a lot of fiscal institutions that are centered here in British Columbia that might want to help you with some of these ideas, and but in terms of posting specific proposals, I think probably what you're going to see is people read different things into the legislation depending upon their particular interest. And you've got an interesting option in front of you in terms of how do you implement that. And the one thing that, of course, is that you can easily say it's going to happen in the future, which is what I've heard, right? This is, we've done this, let's implement it later. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of dissatisfaction because people are going to say, well, it's just words. I think one of the options you might want to consider is an innovation process. Is say, here's a process that we think can lead to this innovation. Here's the collaborative process. I'll give you an idea of how we approach these sort of problems. There's got to be a provincial method of doing this, right? And you might want to say, this is how we're thinking of doing this, just to give it a little bit of a push. And I know there's a lot of you, and it'd be super hard to agree on that process, but anyway, that might be a way to move this forward and see if, you know, because we'll look at that and we'll say, okay, well, how do we help with that? Here's, you know, how do we, you know, be part of that process that you're thinking of going through for implementation? And I think that's sort of your, I don't know, just as a thought, I think that's something you might want to think about as, like, what do you do practically? How do you practically make these changes? And, you know, like, you know, maybe it's something similar to the way we approach it, maybe it's your own process, but you should think about that. Like, how are you going to get to the real legislation, the institutions? Because when you think about UNDRIP, yes, there's First Nation institutions, but the real innovation has got to happen here too. You've got to think of your own institutions. How are they going to change to make this reality? And the best way to do that, of course, is by working together. And so we've got some options for how we think we can work together.
Well, what an afternoon. A lot of food for thought, proposals for practical action, and opportunities to work together. And that certainly applies in the fiscal and economic domain, but I think a lot of what we heard today, at least conceptually, is transferable to other policy domains. So take from it what you will. Hopefully you'll come away inspired a little bit to move forward on your reconciliation efforts. That concludes our talk for today, and one final round of applause for Andre. That was fantastic. And thank you all for your interest and coming out. It's well appreciated.